Hey there, everyone. Hope you're doing very well today. Welcome back to British History. Today, we are going to dig into British politics, and I know that can make your eyes maybe glaze over almost instantly when somebody says that. But if you stick with me, it's actually significantly more interesting than you might think. This is a uh, aspect of the British world that is way more interesting than most Americans tend to expect. It's a lot more lively and just lots more ins and outs. And just recently, they've been dealing with the Brexit issue, which we'll talk about toward the end here. But that in itself has been particularly fascinating. And what's interesting is that for the last, a couple times I've taught this class, every the each of the semesters I've been like, well, Brexit is maybe going to happen because the vote was back in 2016, and now this is the first semester I can actually say they got Brexit accomplished. They finally figured out how to make it actually happen, even though it had been going on since 2016. So we can talk more about that in a little bit. But for now, I was going to jump into more of an overview here of the British political world, just to kind of help you understand how it's structured, and by doing so, allow it to make more sense when we talk about, say, Brexit and things like that. Okay, so the United Kingdom. What they mean by that, when people say, oh, I'm going over to the UK, or this came from the UK, what they're meaning is the conglomeration of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So England here, Scotland, there's a line about right there that designates Scotland, Wales is here, and Northern Ireland. So we'll get to why just Northern Ireland here shortly. But each of these areas has its own personality, and in more recent years, they've gained more autonomy within the individual areas. But they're still, as of right now, unless something changes, which it could, this is the UK. Now, each of these is its own entity, really, and a lot of people in those individual areas can think of themselves as English or Scottish or Welsh or Northern Irish, but overall they still uh, consider themselves, of the UK. They especially say, and that's also a term where you get the term British. That is often sort of interchangeable with UK when people are talking. So a lot of times they say English people will call Scottish people Scottish unless they do something really, really important, like win Wimbledon or something like that. And then all of a sudden those Scottish people are called British because they want to claim them. But those are sort of inside jokes that they like to make among themselves. But this is the general structure here. Now, just to give you a quick rundown on how all this came to be. So all these used to be individual countries. Before that, they were individual small little kingdoms that were in these, general like county type areas, maybe a little bit bigger than that. And then those merged into countries, and then all those countries got merged into the UK. So then we're talking about England being our base here, just thinking of it from that perspective. So 1535 and 42 laws were extended, and that annexed Wales into England here, so that it just became part of England. And then 1606, 1607, the Acts of Union added Scotland. So now you have the United Kingdom of Great Britain, this being Great Britain here. And then in 1801, they added Ireland, the whole of Ireland, not just this little orange part here. And that's kind of another story that we could, maybe get into at some other point, or I would encourage you to look up on your own. But despite the fact that you could swim over to Ireland here, the English tended to treat it as sort of a colony and treated it fairly poorly for quite a long time, especially through much of the Victorian era. And they added it to the UK, so it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And so that's how you ended up with, the full name there. That was in 1801. And then 122 years later, or 21 years later, 5/6 of Ireland here seceded from the UK, and now it's called, and this is what it is today, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And so they've kept this little piece here as part of the whole. And so that's still an area of good bit of tension there, but generally they're on good terms today. And so that's how we ended up where we are on the general structure of the UK. And if you want a bit of a review on that, there's a video that I'll link below here. It's basically a recap, just with C.G.B. Gray, one of his early videos. It's just explaining the UK in about 5 minutes. If you just want to recap on how that all works. And let's go do a quick here overview of what is the UK government. So for a very long time, the entirety of the UK government was the monarch, and the monarch was all of the power. And slowly, over time, the monarch not gave away, but sometimes had power taken away from them, or made deals with Parliament such that Parliament gained more and more power over time. And now that has led over time to what we have here, which is a constitutional monarchy. And most of the monarchies that you have in the world today are constitutional monarchies. They're monarchies. There may be a royal family in various countries, but the power lies with the parliament of the country, the elected body. And the monarch, you may have a few powers. Oftentimes they're just figureheads or are more of a diplomatic role, but that's the world that they inhabit. But today, the structure is the crown and parliament, and then the government, which is like the various ministers in government, all that, led by the prime minister, who is typically the leading member of the party in parliament with the most seats. So let's say there's 300 seats in parliament. If one of the parties controls 200 of those seats, then they would be the one who selects the prime minister, and that's the person who essentially acts like is the U.S. president, or is the counterpart to the U.S. president. So they're the ones who would, if the country goes to war, would lead the country in that regard, or, all those sorts of things. So currently, this is Boris Johnson. He's helping currently lead the effort in the UK to deal with the coronavirus crisis. That's that situation. So the crown today traditionally was the executive power, and this was considered to be power bestowed by God. And so that's kind of hard to argue with and deny for much of history. Today, the power of the crown is largely ceremonial, still an important role. If a major political figure, a president or prime minister from another country comes, they'll often have a state dinner at the at the palace, which is a really, really big deal. And so the executive power lies with the prime minister today, but there's still a good bit of influence. We'll put it that way. Not direct power, like they can't sign something and affect government in any great way, but they can influence because the institution that is the crown, and you can think of it almost as like this component of the government. That has this really incredible institutional knowledge in it that has a certain amount of wisdom to it and weight to its opinions and things like that. And so the monarch does wield a significant amount of influence, even if not real power today. And again, mostly diplomatic duties. And now the real executive power lies with the prime minister. And if you are looking for the prime minister, a good place to go would be right here. This is number 10 Downing Street, not too far from Buckingham Palace. It's compared to our White House in the U.S. It's fairly unassuming. It's in a row of sort of almost like there are a lot of offices, but also like living buildings people live in. And it's just looks like a regular door. So a lot of times, if the prime minister is going to make a speech, they put a little podium right there, and they just walk outside and make a speech, and the press will all be kind of gathered there. To our eyes, it's a little bit awkward just because it's so kind of tight quarters, but it is the seat of power, and this whole building, up above, is a structure of offices that serve the executive branch, which is interesting in itself. So again, this is the leader of the House of Commons with the most seats, whether their party has the most seats. And then let's say they have an election and all of a sudden another party has the most seats. It's time to select a new prime minister. Then that party will select their prime minister. Usually it's a leader of the party, somebody who's already in a leadership role. And then when that's done, the crown will invite the prime minister to form a government. And so it's a formality, but it's an official thing. And so the prime minister will go and meet with the current monarch, and that person will give the official invite to form a government, and then that person will go and be picking ministers to serve various roles, like Minister of Agriculture or Defense, those sorts of roles that the president in the U.S. often does with their cabinet. And so some of the previous prime ministers here, excuse me, I hear that way too often. So in order here, if you stepped one further back here, that would have been Tony Blair. You may or may not have seen pictures of him previously. Back when the U.S. was involved in efforts with the Gulf War, that was George W. Bush's, not the second Gulf War, that was George W. Bush's counterpart. And so he and Tony Blair were involved in just dealing with Iraq and stuff like that on a quite regular basis. Beyond that, beyond him, we got David Cameron here. He oversaw a coalition government. That's when neither party has a very clear victory as far as seats, and so it's hard for them to govern without significant influence by the other party. And so there's been on occasion where they've needed a coalition government. In fact, this was the first time that they had done it since World War II. And he was kind of best known for things that happened during his time there. Well, maybe it's that way for every prime minister, but a few things that happened that weren't exactly related to him. One, they had the Olympics happened in London there, and that was a big to do. And also the Scottish referendum, which we'll talk about here shortly, and the Brexit vote happened, which we'll also talk about. But I will be back here in just a second. We'll finish up this section.